Yeah. I'll just briefly say, so what principal components analysis does is it actually just looks at what's the kind of big overall stuff that's going on in like all the data, usually. Okay. Now, it may or may not be the case that what the big underlying stuff that's going on in all the data is also the most informative dimension for trying to figure out what's the difference between Class A and Class B. And in fact, it's actually not that difficult to make an example in which the two are not in the same direction at all. In fact, yeah, we can draw some pictures. You can draw pictures with ovals that actually sort of clearly show that. But so it's actually a very crucial distinction between sort of finding the underlying directions of maximum variance, which is what this does, and finding the most discriminative directions, which can actually sometimes go in completely different directions.
Right.
So the thing about sumo wrestlers and basketball players is looking for a discriminative direction, which is related to, but crucially different from this. But that's sort of a slightly different topic.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to leave this in a moment, but many of you are probably thinking, I'm past the stage at which I should be showing pictures of what principal component analysis is. Okay, and that's probably true. But for those of you who are thinking that, you might just want to ask yourself, for instance, do you know why, say, principal component analysis is calculated by looking at the eigenvectors of a covariance matrix? This is just for, I'm trying to make people feel uncomfortable here, but it's actually, in my opinion, feeling uncomfortable is actually a very good state to be in order to do research, because the moment you feel comfortable, you're not going to learn anything new. So for those of you who think you already know everything there is to know about principal component analysis, you might want to ask yourself, why does playing with a covariance matrix actually give you this stuff? We can talk about that later, but that's not relevant right now. But I just wanted to suggest that it's actually worth thinking about that, even if you think you're already very familiar with that. Okay, but the crucial point here is that there's underlying this big semantic space, there seems to be some stuff going on underneath that sort of seems to capture some of what the brain seems to be doing. Okay? But it definitely doesn't capture all of what the brain's doing. But let's have a look at some of the things. So these things, PC1's principal, these are the first 4 biggest principal components that came out from looking at the way the brain is representing meaning in this particular Hutherdal-Galant lab study. Okay? So this one seems to be very much putting a lot of weight on, does something move? Animicity means, does it move itself, right? Is it an animal versus a non-animal, or biological versus non? A lot of these end up being quite similar. So what this suggests is that, so the fact this is the first principal component means that this is like the thing that was the biggest thing that jumped out, right? That actually explained the most variance in the data. So what this says is, in the question of how does the brain represent meaning, or how does the brain even just represent objects and concepts, one of the most important factors is, does this thing move itself or not? Is this an animate or an inanimate object, right? Now, and there's actually, you can, if you remember we showed a sort of similarity space from Krieger's-Korter and Kiani work, where they compared monkey and human similarity structure. And actually, that was the biggest thing that jumped out of that as well. So this turns out to be a very big factor in the brain. And you can, of course, tell a very good evolutionary story as to why this should be the case, right? So, things that move themselves might eat you, right? And generally speaking, are quite good, are likely, if they don't eat you, they might be good to eat, right? So this is a very good way to carve up the world if you want to survive. What's the second biggest thing that jumped out? This is sort of interesting too. Human versus non-human, social versus non-social, civilization versus nature. I'm not exactly sure how they define that, probably man-made objects versus, okay? So now this is something you would expect. So this is something that's very similar in terms of the way meaning is represented in monkey brains and human brains. Meaning not, including non-linguistic meaning, just sort of how concepts are grouped together. This thing seems very human. Okay? So voxels that had a lot of stuff going on with this principal component were probably ones that became very active every time there was a person in the scene, probably even more every time there were people interacting with each other. Some of you are going to be joining labs which spend their entire energy looking at how the brain represents social interactions of people with each other. So this will be a principal component that will be important in the next couple of years of your life. What's another one? You'll notice, by the way, that as you go down through the principal components, it gets harder and harder to explain what they're actually doing. Okay? This is also a very, very common thing, not just in analyzing brain data, but in analyzing any type of data. If you take any type of data and you try and look at the big underlying main explanatory features, if you're lucky, the first couple will come out and they'll sort of make intuitive sense. And after that, the chance that they'll make intuitive sense gets lower and lower. It doesn't mean they're not important, it just means they're harder to think about. And unfortunately, that's the brain and the world in general is not obliged to sort of decompose itself into things that we find easy to think about. Okay, what's this one doing, PC3? Let's see, it's got some stuff of mobile versus immobile and animacy. It's got a lot of stuff of man-made, civilization versus nature, which I guess means man-made versus natural, animal versus non-animal. So this maybe is sort of like, was this made by human beings or not? Maybe, but it's less clear. Okay, there's something going on about place versus non-place. This is perhaps, if you were forced to stick a label on this, you would say something like, man-made versus natural. But you would be aware, you'd feel a bit uncomfortable, and you'd think, nah, this is not. That label is not quite getting it, but it's getting some of it. Okay, okay, what's going on in this one, the fourth principal component? That is sort of quite similar to this. We've got stuff going on with mobile versus immobile and animacy. We've got stuff going on animal and non-animal. But now there's like social versus non-social going on as well. So this is sort of like some weird mixture of, was it made by a human being, does it move itself, and does it involve people? Right? And so this is incredibly typical. The one reason why I'm showing this is, well, first of all, because that Hoof paper is extremely interesting. It wasn't actually one of the required readings, but if you're interested in this, I do highly recommend it. I mean, we did see the video. The video does a nice job of explaining it too. But this slide sort of captures some of the problems of thinking about how the brain represents the world and how the brain represents meaning. Okay, so we can measure stuff. And we can capture big underlying regularities, but once we try and figure out what those big underlying regularities actually mean, it gets quite complicated quite quickly. Okay? So this is easy. This is animate versus inanimate, probably. This is easy. This is, does this have something to do with people? This has something, is it something to do with man-made versus non-man-made? And this one is it something to do with man-made versus non-man-made, and is it moving, and does it have some people in it? Okay? And then you might say, oh, well, this one is really just some combination of the previous three, so this isn't really a new thing. This is just some sort of mushy mixture of these. Okay, but it isn't. Okay, that's why this is sort of showing that this is stuff that we don't really understand properly. Okay, by the very construction. By what principal components analysis and other related type of analysis do, this absolutely definitely is not just a mixture of these things. Okay, just the way that the technique works, it pulls out things that are completely orthogonal, completely at right angles to each other. Okay, so even though this thing might look like it's just some sort of mushy mixture of this, it's actually really capturing something completely different. It's just that whatever that completely different thing is of how the brain represents meaning, it's not something that is very easy for us to put a sort of, a word label on. And that's kind of one of, if you wanted to summarize in a single picture where we are at with our understanding of language in the brain, that wouldn't be a terrible way of doing it, because, it's really hard to say what's going on once you get past the big features. Okay, I think I already showed this last time. This is also, I think I showed this picture last time. This is showing the more brightly colored a part of the brain is, the more this model was able to explain it. And probably the key thing to notice is that most of the brain is not brightly colored. Okay? So there's lots and lots of stuff that we can't explain. Which means there's lots and lots of interesting open questions. When you're doing your projects, there will probably come a point, especially after you've done a PubMed search or Google Scholar search that's yielded 11,000 hits, you'll probably think, oh man, I don't think there are any open questions. Okay? The one thing that I can say with great confidence is there definitely will be open questions. It might take a little while to find out what they are, but persevere in that. And in fact, if you actually kind of battle through that point of saying, oh dear, I really don't think there are any open questions, aha, here's what some of them are. If you've pushed through that point, you've already got a good project. Okay, because that's kind of like, that sort of in a nutshell is the most difficult part of, or one of the many difficult parts of doing science, sort of figuring out, at first it really does seem like everyone knows everything, and then pretty soon you'll realize, oh no, there's actually a lot of stuff that we don't know. And then after a while it will seem like nobody knows anything. That's a separate kind of worry to have. You're actually getting closer to the truth once you've gone to that point. But in terms of like not being too paralyzed, you want to sort of get to this point where, okay, there's this much that's known, but there's this stuff that's not known. And that would be interesting to look at. Actually, this reminds me of one question that one person sent me an email is, can the project be a review article? And I said, well, that's fine in the sense that review sort of does the part that says what's known, but I would encourage you, and I think this is just an interesting and fun thing to think about, but also this is sort of what I hope the project will have. I encourage you to really try and push beyond that to the part of, what do we not know? At least, not what's everything that we don't know, because that's going to be a lot, okay? But what's like one or two, preferably even just one interesting question that it sort of looks like we don't know, but we've got enough of a handle on that we can start to try and ask about. And, and then you could suggest, well, here's a way of asking about this. So that's sort of the way in which the project would go just a little bit beyond a review article. Although having said that, very good review articles, and you'll find this in Trends in Cognitive Sciences and Current in Neurobiology, especially in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, they often actually have a box called something like Currently Open Questions. Okay? And that's really nice because it's important to bear that in mind that, I think that it's important that it's valuable to try and push past this part and of thinking, so much has already been done, and try and find where the open questions are. Okay, so one place where there's a lot of open questions is this other theory of meaning that we'll just spend a little bit of time talking about, which is this embodied theory, which actually sort of has some interesting relations to philosophy if you're into that sort of thing, but is very directly tied to neuroscience as well. This takes this big question of how are words represented in the brain, and it tries to make it quite concrete. And I mean that in a very literal sense. That it actually says, fundamentally, words are represented in terms of our senses. Okay? So this is why it's called embodied, that the idea is that if we're not just brains in vats, okay, we're brains in bodies, and our bodies are like interacting with the world, and that's where meaning comes from. So one of the really influential, probably the most influential person in this is Larry Barstow, at least in cognitive science, who sort of talks about this problem of grounding the meanings of words, so symbol grounding. So if I've got some word, like, this really does connect with philosophy actually, if you're interested in that. Okay. If I have, I've got a bottle of water, okay? So if I say, how do I know that the meaning, the word bottle refers to this thing? Well, this is one of the things it refers to, okay? Well, this theory says, well, the way my brain represents bottle is not just that there's this sort of abstract thing called bottle, which is, like a container that is sort of thin at one end and has stuff in it. Okay, but it's partly the fact that I pick the bottle up, and I hold it, and I look at it, and I can drink from it. I'm physically interacting with this bottle using my touch, my sight, my mouth, my sense of taste. Okay, so that's what makes the word bottle mean bottle, according to this theory, because it's sort of a summary of like all the physical interactions which I have with bottle. Now, bottle I'm interacting with in lots of different ways. I'm looking at it, touching it, tasting it. Okay. Other words are much more rooted in particular modality. This one was the reading, but this is I happen to be involved in a grant at the moment with Jeff Binder and Rufik because I'm decoding language, so I'm sort of thinking about this stuff a lot these days. This guy Pulvermuller has done a lot of work on this too. And that was the reading. So let's have a look. So what are some of the sense modalities that are actually have been shown to be involved in representing the meanings of words? Well, they're actually exactly the ones you'd expect. That they're the sensory cortices. Okay, so here's your motor strip here. I'll show you a concrete example of this in a minute. Action words tend to activate your motor strip. So a word like run, jump, kick. Okay, even if I speak the word, if I say the child kicked the ball. Well, I actually sort of mimed it when I said it, but suppose I do it and I'm not physically miming it, and I'm not really trying to think about the process of moving my foot. The idea is that just by conjuring up the meaning of the word kick, that's actually going to bring up some activation in the motor strip. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So color here's this is sort of ventral temporal cortex, sort of V4 type area. Got motion, this sort of MT. Sound, auditory cortex. So in the most literal sense, the idea is that different sensory modalities are active and involved in representing words that sort of are involved in that those senses would interact with. But it goes a little bit beyond that. So here's emotion. Okay, if you're interested in say neurobiology of depression, I know one or two of you will be. This is a very. Do any of you guys know this brain area here? This is called. So here's your cingulate cortex, and there's a bit here that sort of looks a bit like a knee, right? This bit at the front looks like a bent knee, and the Latin for knee is genuus or something. So this is called subgenual cingulate cortex. This sort of bit quite near your eyes here. This turns out to be very involved in emotion and depression, and people even actually do stimulation of this area to try and treat resistant depression. Helen Mayberg pioneered that. So some of these areas are even, so this is sort of embodied too. Emotions actually, you sort of feel emotions with your body, okay, in large part. And so this is still also a type of embodiment looking at the emotional aspect of words. So that's from a Jeff Binder paper. Here's from the Pulvermuller paper. This font is a bit smaller, so you might not see it. Okay, so this is the same kind of idea that you've got these different sensory modalities, and the idea of what's being shown here is that a given word is going to sort of tend to activate the relevant circuits. So the word kick is literally going to activate your motor and somatosensory cortex. And it turns out it might even activate a specific part of it. I'll show you that in a minute. The words to do with shape, like square, will activate your sort of ventral temporal cortex that we were just doing that PubMed search for that tends to be sensitive to form. Okay, there's part of your lower part of your motor strip that actually turns out to represent your mouth. So mouth type words like lick or eat or taste would be tend to activate that. And then you might have, I like this bit. This sort of shows the weakness of this is not a weakness of this particular theory. This shows the weakness of our human race's understanding of language in general. And then you've got this bigger thing called general lexico-semantic. That sort of means like all the other stuff that we can't quite fit into these. But people are aware that this is a problem. Okay, but it's kind of striking that for words that really do have a sort of, they really do talk about parts of your body, they actually literally activate the parts of your brain that move those parts of the body. Okay, so, and it's worth repeating, if I say the word kick and I don't move my feet, I'm not moving my feet, okay? But I'm still, it turns out, actually activating the part of the brain that would move my feet if I were moving my feet. Okay, so have you all seen this sort of picture before? Okay, if you have, this was actually discovered in the 50s by a guy called Wilder Penfield. If you ever go up to Montreal, there's a street near McGill called like Rue Wilder Penfield. It's like named after him. So we were talking about maps in the cortex, we were talking about visual maps. This is, it turns out, is the motor map, okay? So this is kind of part of your brain, is called the motor strip. On the opposite side of the big central sulcus is a very similar map of the sort of touch sensation parts of your brain. The somatosensory cortex has very similar structure. There's a couple of things to notice about this. First thing to notice is that parts of your body that you have very fine-grained motor control of get a lot of cortical representation. Just like in the visual map, your fovea, the central part of your visual field, gets lots of representation. So, we as especially human beings do lots of stuff with our hands and fingers. Okay? So look how big the hands and fingers are here. And we do lots of stuff with our mouths and lips. Okay, we talk, for instance. Okay, I mean, it's not just chewing. Talking is much more fine-grained motor control. Mouth, lips. We make facial expressions that convey lots of social information to each other. Okay, so there's a very big representation of that as well. Now, the one thing I just want to point out here is, well, let me show you actually. Okay, so you probably can't see this because it's not very good contrast. But the blue stuff is words related to leg or feet, okay, and that's sort of up here in the brain. This is a sort of meta-analysis from the Pulvermuller paper of where you get activation for different types of words. Yeah, unfortunately, that you can't really see this, so I'll just tell you. The blue stuff is feet or leg-related words. The red stuff is words related to arms or hands, like, grasp, poke, stuff like that. This would be, kick, run, jump. The green stuff is face or mouth related symbols. So this would be things like smile, taste, chew. Okay? So feet, hands, mouth. Now let's go back to the somatosensory map. Okay? Feet and legs and mouth. Feet and legs, hands, and mouth. Okay, so there's literally, so you've got this motor map in your brain of like, if you were to actually, so what Wilder Penfield actually discovered is if you stick an electrode in some, I think this was with epileptic patients, if you stick an electrode in here, you'll make someone's finger wiggle. Okay, if you stick an electrode in here and stimulate a bit, you'll make their lips twitch. Okay, if you stick an electrode in here, you'll make their toes wiggle. If you actually get them to think about a word, such as poke, you'll get activation in the hand area cortex. So you might say, well, this is great. Now we know how words are represented in the brain. They're just mapped directly onto our bodies. Our brain already has maps of our bodies in it, and moving and perceiving. So that's language, right? Well, what types of words would this be good for, and what types of words would this maybe struggle with? Yeah.
Concrete words like run and jump, and it's not clear how these findings would extend to things like entropy and justice and love.
Good. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is actually like one of the core issues that I'm studying, so that's why I'm like.
Oh yeah. Wait, you're studying what? I didn't know you were studying language.
Well, no, I'm interested in sort of embodied.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Representations.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, that's sort of like the key criticism is, one of the key criticisms is how does the overwhelming, they're what,
right.
Like at that 15
Yeah, this
study.
is very compelling, right?
Yeah, right. How does this extend, two things, how does it extend to abstract concepts?
Right.
And do patients with damage to some of these areas lose sort of knowledge of what these concepts are? So how critical is the activation and index of sort of the extraction of meaning?
Okay.
Right? Or is it some like of a byproduct of?
Okay, interesting. Okay, well that's very interesting. Actually, so I know that Brad Mahone, who Frank works with, and Alfonso Carras actually have a review article specifically saying, beyond or against the embodied view or something, right? And I'd love to chat with you more about that.
Yeah.
So the problem is, and you don't even have to go as abstract as entropy,
Right.
Which is very abstract. It's about as abstract as you can get. But even if you just have a word like, weak, like a week, sorry, that's not a good word, like 7 days, like a month, okay?
Yeah.
Right? There's no part of my body that corresponds to a year or a month or an hour, right? That's kind of concrete-ish because you have to, you don't have to like go to a university to deal with this kind of stuff, right? Or, I'm going to, I mean, we use abstract words all the time without even thinking. I need to renew my driver's license.
Yeah.
Okay, right? Well, driving, okay, I guess that's sort of concrete. What's a license? A license is the fact that I'm permitted to do a certain type of activity. Right? That's incredibly abstract. It doesn't feel as abstract as, entropy or just. If you ask people for abstract words, they often come out with these very sort of, like highfalutin type words like justice and, truth and beauty and stuff like that. Okay, but you don't need to. The world gets very abstract very quickly. I looked at my shopping list and I saw that I needed to buy 3 things. Right? There's lots of abstract stuff going on. A list. What's a list? Right? What's 3? Right? These are very, very abstract things, and they happen all the time. Okay, so this is this is a nice theory, but it's unclear. Actually, this Pulvermuller article talks about trying to extend this to abstraction, and you have to make your own decisions about how far it goes. It suggests that if you bring in emotion, this is actually an interesting theory. If you bring in emotion, then you can start to get, because emotion, we do have some idea of how some types of emotion are represented in the brain to some degree, especially fear and maybe some sadness, maybe. Definitely fear. So there's a theory that abstract words are sort of embodied plus emotion equals abstract. Okay, but if I say, I looked at my list and I saw I had to buy 3 things. List is not really a very emotional word, usually. Okay, 3 is not really a very emotional word, but they're definitely abstract. So, and the people who proposed the series were fully aware of this. So. But it's a promising looking approach. And it actually, what's interesting is that even if you don't care at all about building embodiment into your theory, if you try and represent words that happen to have a relation to our body, it's going to crop up anyway. Okay? So Tom Mitchell's representation of the word celery was by going and, trawling through a trillion words of the Google text corpus. It didn't involve looking at anybody's brains or bodies or anything. But if you then take that purely text-derived model and you say, what does it predict for the word celery, it actually turns out that you get this part of the brain that's sort of, your mouth area, right? Gustatory cortex, it's called. So, anyway, so this is Pulvermuller's picture where he tries to say, well, how can we go into abstraction? So, he tackles people, they realize it's a problem. So you say, well, if it's concrete meaning, you have, a lot of things, the words are strongly linked to the symbols, okay? So if I use the word I, right, that's going to activate parts of my brain that are involved in controlling my eyes. That makes sense. And then if you say abstract meaning, well, now it has weaker links to the symbol, and there's sort of a family resemblance. That's actually a term from philosophy as well. So that's sort of another way of saying, yeah, we know it doesn't work as well for abstract stuff, but we think it might work, maybe. Now, maybe that will really turn out to work. No one knows. Or maybe that will fail in just the same way as the behavior, when the behavior said, hey, everything's just a bunch of associations, and Chomsky said, well, I ain't going to explain language. Maybe it will fail like that too. Nobody knows. These are very open questions.
Just to,
yeah.
It's, I mean, everyone, and just, I went to CNS, this past week.
Yeah, Compton Neuroscience
yeah,
Society.
And everyone is like, and there were many posters looking at sort of where abstract conceptual content might be sort of represented in the brain, and with this idea that Binder proposes is maybe it's, I think his idea is it's like looking at.
Well, there's 2 questions. Okay, so I'm sorry. We'll finish in a second, but
yeah.
So one question is where might abstract stuff happen? So there's a lot of evidence, for instance, that there's sort of frontal, like end of the temporal pole, or there's some sort of frontal area. So one question is, which parts of the brain are involved in representing abstract things? And the answer is probably stuff nearer the front. And in fact, anytime you have anything that's sort of complicated, or it usually gets represented by stuff that's nearer the front of your head. Okay. But that in itself doesn't tell you how is the brain representing this, right? And even more, it's not telling you if I wanted to be able, to decode from someone's brain, not just, well, they're thinking about, eating a stick of celery or kicking a ball, but are they thinking about, oh, I need to buy 3 items on my shopping list? Mm-hmm. Just knowing, oh, well, let's look nearer the front of the head won't actually tell you how the brain represents that.
Absolutely.
So
it's like the fundamental issue.
And I know I say this a lot, but here it's really true. Nobody knows the answer to that question. Okay, nobody. Okay, but people, including actually my colleagues on the ground and many other people, are at least trying to sort of hammer away at it a little bit. But it's a very, very big and open question. So on Tuesday, I'm yet again not going to be here, but hopefully, actually, I'm going to be at a meeting for a grant trying to look at these kind of questions. But we're going to have a computer practical on Tuesday. Exact topic to be determined, but I'll send out an email about that. And I've heard actually, I'm very, very grateful to Dan for doing these practicals, and I've heard very positive feedback about them. So I hope I'm sure you'll enjoy that. And I think doing hands-on stuff is good. One person emailed me earlier saying, I would like to meet with you, and I haven't met you yet. And I said, hey, how about meeting for 15, 20 minutes after class? And that person actually isn't here right now. I think they might be at the conference. So if any of you, now would be quite a good time to grab me for like 15, 20 minutes. If any of you have, in any point in the past, sent me an email saying, could I meet with you about a project, and I just haven't gone back to you yet. So you can come grab me now, or you could send me an email. We could set up a time. But I would, I'd love to. It's my job to, help you guys work through that. And I've met with some, but not all of you. So please feel free to come and grab me now if you'd like to chat about that. And have a good weekend, and have fun thinking about policy and abstract.
I actually just received a PDF from this one guy who was presenting.
Yeah, I don't know if
this guy's supposed to.
I know some of these people. fMRI is like big N400 person. Yeah. Lexical is actually very interesting. He's a relational person. Yeah.